This is the right time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Bomani is out. Sarah Spain and Nick Friedel in with you. You can tweet us on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed. Guest appear via the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. We look forward to having Ramona Shelburne on later this hour to break down the Chris Paul news. And before we get back into that, I wanted to quickly point out, and I saw this on my timeline, we were just talking about how we are very old and we prefer to read our news than see it on video. And all these different outlets are now laying off a lot of writers in favor of doing more video content. And the Reuters Institute's annual report on digital news, which recently came out, for the second year in a row, this was one of the more surprising findings that they had in last year's report was that most people did not like getting news from online video, and this year's report shows the exact same thing. Video news not growing as fast as you'd think, and most people answered that they got little to no news via video online, that they were more interested in reading it and being consumed, even on social media, that they preferred to read. So maybe, Nick, we're not so alone.
There's hope, Sarah Spain.
In wanting to read words instead of getting everything in GIF form and video form. But the big news of the day that we've been talking about, obviously, Chris Paul manages to somehow look like a good dude in leaving the Clippers while also filling his pockets. And this is how, if you're just joining us, he knew he wanted to leave the Clippers. But if he had left as a free agent, he loses his bird rights, which allows him to sign a 5-year, $205 million deal next year. So instead of simply leaving, he tells the Clippers, look, I want out of here and I want to go to the Rockets. If I tell you this now, I'll re-up, I'll opt in, you trade me to the Rockets, you get something in return instead of me leaving, and then I get to go there and still have my bird rights because it's via trade and not via free agency. Obviously, we mentioned he is a big part of the NBA Players Association, knows that CBA up and down, made the best move for himself financially. Yet to see what kind of fit this will be. And it was interesting that Mark Spears thought that it would be more of a split point guard position between him and Harden. You and I both assumed that Paul would take over pretty much full-time point guard duties and send Harden back to playing off the ball. But Mark Spears seems to think that they might split those duties.
Yeah, Sarah, that was the first time I'd heard that as well when Mark told us earlier in the show that it was, in fact, Harden who still may run a large chunk of the offense here. I'm still having a lot of doubts on if this is going to work long term because over time both of these guys in Harden and Paul have proven that they need the ball in order to do what they want to do on the floor. So maybe it can, and maybe they get used to playing with one another in the backcourt, and surely their friendship is going to help bridge the gap in any differences they may have. But from a broader perspective, I've got to give Houston and Daryl Morey, their general manager, a huge amount of credit because there are so many executives in the league right now, Sarah, who are punting and who are playing for 2 or 3 years from now and who are looking at the landscape with LeBron dominating in Cleveland and with the Warriors having the super team of all super teams with all those guys in their 20s and Durant and Curry and Klay Thompson and Draymond Green and thinking, now is not the time to start adding pieces because you're not going to be able to beat them. Daryl Morey, as usual, has found a way to add and make his team better, and now we'll see just what else they can do. I know Tim McMahon, our colleague based out of Dallas, he said he talked to a source earlier today who thinks that the Rockets are either going to land Carmelo or Paul George in the next few weeks. Then you add that to what they've already got with Chris Paul and James Harden, so you never know. But you have to give the Rockets ownership, Les Alexander, and the front office led by Morey the benefit of the doubt because they're finding ways to still remain competitive and spend money. And in the new era of the league, you don't see that a lot. You see teams rebuild and try to build through the draft.
Yeah, and I think, like we mentioned earlier, with Phil Jackson not adjusting to the new power structure, it'll be interesting to see which teams find creative ways to work around the way that the athlete in the NBA has taken much more control and agency. This obviously works in part because it's somewhere that he wanted to go and because Harden recruited him and because they have a relationship. It's obviously tougher to do elsewhere. But, I read some stats earlier about some interesting kind of conflicts that might come into play. We know D'Antoni's offense. We know offensively there's so much success for people who play within that offense. The speed and the shooting and the aggressiveness with which he sends his guys out there. As I said earlier, Chris Paul is 10 out of 12 seasons, his teams have played at a pace slower than league average. They've never been in the top 5. So we'll see if maybe this opens up his game even more. According to ESPN's Real Plus Minus, he was the second most productive player in the entire NBA behind only LeBron James last season. So even though we've sort of, I don't know, there's something about the Clippers as dominant as they can be in the regular season. We kind of write them off before they even get bounced because we feel like we know it's going to happen. Maybe in this new setting and in this new system, we might see that Chris Paul is not quite as it's not that anyone thought he wasn't good anymore, but I feel like he hasn't gotten his due of late.
Yeah, and part of that is because he hasn't been able to elevate the Clippers over the hump,
right,
Sarah, in the postseason. It seems like they've just kind of tapped out year after so much promise. But I'm curious about the pace numbers as well, because when you bring in a guy like Paul who has had so much success in his career and is absolutely going to the Hall of Fame whenever he decides to hang him up. When you, at this stage, try to force him into a different offense, how big of an adjustment is it? The thing that would give me solace if I'm Daryl Morey or I'm Mike D'Antoni is you talk to guys all over the league. They love playing fast. They love getting shots up, and in Paul's case, as a point guard for a long, long time, they love getting everybody involved in the offense. And when you watch Houston on tape, Houston has the type of system that players can really thrive in. And when you have the type of talent that's already there in James Harden, and you plug a guy like Chris Paul in, there are a lot of different possibilities. So strictly as a fan, you're watching and you're saying, this is something that we haven't seen before with this kind of point guard surrounded by a type of talent like Harden, and I'm really curious to see how it plays out. I just don't believe in the end, even if they were to add Paul George or Carmelo, Sarah, that they're that much better today in going after a team like Golden State than they were before.
Well, and there were two stats that I saw, and this might be something that the sabermetricians and the new stat era guys, the Haberstros and the Hollingers might have to break down for me, but I can't figure this out. Harden had the second highest usage rate last season. Chris Paul's usage rate was tied for 40th, okay? But then Harden ranked first in time of possession last season, and Chris Paul ranked 7th. It makes sense to me that Harden would have the second highest usage rate and rank first in time of possession. How the heck does Chris Paul rank 7th in time of possession with a 40th usage rate?
The numbers
does
don't
that
add
mean
up
that
sometimes.
He wasn't on the court as much, but when he was, he always had the ball?
Yeah, that's the way I took it. But Sarah, again, this ties back into what we're going through here. Chris Paul always had the ball in Los Angeles. He was always the guy in charge of getting things rolling and making guys like Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan look good going to the rim. So now what happens when you have another guy in Harden who's used to always having the ball? I mean, it's one of the most important and intriguing storylines going into next season. It's just for Houston. Then what happens as we push this thing forward a year from now? I mean, Chris Paul's going to be 32, 33 years old. Are you willing to sign him for $200 million, Sarah? You think that's something that you have to do now, having made this deal?
Well, worth noting that the previous CBA made it so that players at a certain age could not be re-upped for it was 36, I believe, that players couldn't sign max contracts that would play them past 36. Now they changed it to 38 with the newest CBA, and wouldn't you know it, when Paul re-signs with the Rockets next summer for that max deal, it'll carry him right through the age of 38. So he has figured out exactly how to work this system. At 32, I think his window is certainly, his prime window is certainly closing. But the good thing for both the Rockets and I guess for Paul in terms of making that next step is if it's not about the money. If it's about the money, he clearly is going to want the Rockets to re-sign. If it's about where he can win and how it will go, it's good for them. They kind of get this practice year where there isn't a ton lost there, and they can see how it works. What do you make of what happens to Griffin? If he leaves, they can't really blame him because Chris Paul's been traded. DeAndre Jordan's one of the few left. If he resigns, then he's the man, and he gets to sort of run the style he wants. Paul isn't the leader or the face of the franchise anymore. He gets the money. He becomes the man. But I don't know if I were Griffin if I would want to stick around.
You'd have to decide how much is enough, Sarah. How much money and how much comfort do you have playing in Los Angeles and playing under Doc Rivers after all these years? I mean, again, in my experience, having covered the league and having listened to all these players talk over time, when they say it's all about winning and they really want to win, what they really mean is it's all about the money. I mean, the only player in recent times where you could point to and say, they made a decision based on winning is David West. He went to San Antonio first, left more money on the table, and then
Dwayne Wade a couple times in Miami, right? And then he never got what he was promised.
Yeah, well, Wade took a little less, Sarah, and then he made sure he was getting it all back in Chicago.
From the Bulls.
the Bulls ended up giving Wade Miami's parting gift.
Right, exactly.
It's really sad if you're a Bulls fan, but the reality is it always hinges on how much guaranteed cash these guys are going to get. And at this point in their careers, Blake Griffin's the same. He's only a couple years younger than Paul. I wouldn't blame him for taking all the money, being the face of a team you're comfortable on, and knowing that you're going to get every shot and every opportunity that you want moving forward. So I think this is the beginning of a rebuild for the Clippers. I just don't know how deep that rebuild goes. And one other thing to remember, Mark Spears told us, again, he said, look, if LeBron ends up in Los Angeles, I don't think it's going to happen for the Clippers. So as much hype as that has gotten in the last few weeks, Sarah, if the Clippers aren't feeling confident that they can land him next summer, they should start to move some pieces and really try a different approach because the one they've been having the last few years, it isn't working well enough for them.
Sarah Spain and Nick Friedel filling in for Bomani on the right time. More NBA coming up, including a Paul George question I've been meaning to ask Nick for a couple days. That's next on ESPN Radio. Jam right there.
Baby, I know.
If it ever comes up in any situation for any occasion and you ask Nick Friedel what song he would like for his bride walking down the aisle, his child's first birthday, a tea time with nanny, it's going to be Twisted by Keith Sweat.
It's the go-to of go-to for me, Sarah.
It's an all-purpose song that you will use for any occasion.
It covers all bases. It puts a smile on my face.
So predictable.
I know it. I know it in my heart that is just that's the song. I mean, I think it all started for me at my in my 7th grade dance when I was trying to get Kim to talk to me.
We don't want to hear what started
that
for
song.
You in your 7th grade dance. Oh boy.
That's when the memories are made.
Sarah Spain and Nick Friedel filling in for Bo on the right time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Nothing makes a summer birthday or anniversary more magical than playing Twisted by Keith Sweat. But if you can't do that, call up 1-800-Flowers.com. Right now, when you order a dozen multicolored roses for only $29.99, you'll get another dozen absolutely free. Go to 1-800-Flowers.com/ESPN. So all this NBA news has us wondering, do we think it's possible that the offseason has now become more exciting than the regular season, Nick? We dogged the regular season all year, and we can't get enough of the offseason.
Absolutely, Sarah. As somebody who covers the league, I think fans have more interest in what happens now prior to the draft and what happens during free agency than they do during the year. I mean, I think it's a fact because all teams are involved and all fans are interested in where the next player is going to land. And Shannon, I know before the show we were talking about this, but you made a great point. It started that summer around 2010 when LeBron and all those guys got together.
Oh, 2010 totally legitimized this whole thing because prior to that, we would have never gave a second thought about a team being able to amass 3 max contract players like they did with Wade, Bosh, and LeBron. But post 2010, you got to pay attention to any kind of speculation, any rumor, any kind of whisper of a player or team or any kind of a transaction. You have to at least acknowledge it now. Like prior to going back to last year, you would have never said, hey, Houston Rockets, they do well when James Harden is ball dominant and has the ball. There's no way they'll be able to trade for Chris Paul. And here we are today, June 28th, talking about Chris Paul being traded to Houston.
Right, and so much of that is because star players, really great players, cannot have an ego anymore that tells them I'll do this alone. The days of Derrick Rose saying, I'm not recruiting, are over. If you are even the best player, if you're Kevin Durant, you're still sucking it up and going to the team that beats you. Because that's the only way to win now is these super teams. And that's a huge part of it is that it doesn't feel like if a team already has a star or two that they're done collecting assets.
Absolutely. And to me, and to Shannon's points, Sarah, the thing that always struck me, there's one picture that I still remember, and that was Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh sitting at the dinner table at a restaurant. And there was an open chair. And you're thinking to yourself at that time, you're like, no way, LeBron's going to join up with all 3 of those guys, and they're going to form this team. How's the money going to work? How's it going to work on the floor? How are all these things going to come together? And then lo and behold, they all signed down in Miami, and they changed the course of the NBA's future. And from a reality TV perspective and a social media reality, it is great for the league because you have this second season that is so robust with rumors and potential landing places and all these different things that have to happen or might happen for different teams. My fear is, as somebody whose livelihood is based in large part on the league itself, guys, I don't know if it's good for the health of the game long term. I think everybody gets so excited with these rumors and these possibilities. But when you start watching the same teams collect the same high-level players, where does that leave everybody else?
Yeah, and I think it as much as we're excited now, I think a lot of the conversation just ends up going to the same spot, which is, wow, what a great deal. They're still not going to beat the Warriors every time, right? No matter what.
Right.
And or what's the point of Paul George going anywhere other than the Cavs? The Cavs are the only team that's one Paul George away from being at least remotely competitive. And that's tough. And we might all be overselling it. You know, the Warriors did end up losing last year when we thought they were unbeatable and people were saying Steph Curry was the greatest player that's ever played. So, you know, we might be jumping ahead of things, but it certainly feels like we're basing everything that's done in the NBA on whether or not it will give them a lead or like a chance against the Warriors. And unfortunately, right now, it doesn't feel like most things will. We'll talk to Ramona Shelburne about all this coming up next. Also, Patrick Mooney, who covers the Cubs, has tweeted out the Cubs are not going to reach out to David Ross after Montero has been DFA'd. And David Ross replies, sorry, guys, I'm out. I've already bedazzled the jersey with a photo of his Cubs jersey completely covered in rhinestones from Dancing with the Stars. So the Cubs are out on Ross. I guess he's not available anymore. We'll talk to Ramona Shelburne next about the Knicks, Chris Paul, and everything else going on in the NBA. It's the right time on ESPN Radio.
Okay, keep your eyes closed.
Okay.
I want to show you my first ever painting.
All right.
Okay. Open your eyes.
Oh, that's a lot of colors and shades.
So be honest. What do you think?
Well, I like how if you switch to Geico, you could save hundreds of dollars on car insurance.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Here, why don't I hold your paintbrush while you call them?
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
Back to the right time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app, presented by Progressive Insurance. Guest appear via the Shell Penzo Performance Line. Hope to have Ramona Shelburne on before the end of the show. Get her thoughts on the latest NBA news. You can always hit us up on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed, at Sarah Spain, at Nick Friedel. So, Nick, I've been meaning to ask you this question for a while. We talked to Dan Dockett the other night about Paul George's legacy in Indy. And I'm trying to get a read on what fans should be thinking about George, because this is a very awkward time right now. He's made it clear he wants to go to the Lakers, doesn't want to be in Indy anymore. They are trying to find a trade partner, knowing that they don't want to lose him for nothing when he becomes a free agent. And I understand anytime a guy wants to leave your city, even if your city doesn't show great promise and they have a small window to win in, you're going to be annoyed. But I think that Paul George pretty much did this as well as you could. You know what I mean? Like, if he doesn't want to re-sign with them, and if he's going to be lost to free agency, then what better way is there than for him to be honest with the team that he's on and tell them, listen, I want to get out of here, here's where I want to go, and at least give them a chance to get something in return.
Absolutely. Sarah, the only problem here is that the Pacers didn't do this earlier. That's right. What has caused all the issues now, because if Larry Bird knew that there was a chance, and it seems by all accounts that George reiterated the same message before the deadline, hey, I want to win a title here, but if it's not going to be possible, I'm going to L.A. If he knew that the Pacers weren't one piece or two pieces away, and I think we all agree that that wasn't the case, if he knew it, he should have just made the move then. Because now what it invites, this situation of George kind of hovering in no man's land, at least for the next few months before a decision is made on whether or not he goes to L.A., is the possibility of George starting the new year in Indianapolis. And, Sarah, who wants that? I mean, that's uncomfortable for everybody. I can remember just a few years ago, the Magic went through the same situation with Dwight Howard. It was an everyday ordeal. It was a constant question, not only for Howard and at that point Stan Van Gundy, but every one of their teammates every day. Where's he going to go? What's the mood like in the locker room? It's a constant distraction. So if you're the Pacers, I was surprised they didn't make something happen before the draft, but you don't have a lot of leverage, and you know that the longer you wait, the less leverage you're even going to have. So if I'm them, knowing the consequences of not dealing George, I'm making sure that by opening night, or even more so in this case, by the start of training camp in a few months, I'm having George out of here and going somewhere else where I can get at least some kind of value in return.
And the other guy who appears to have done things right, even though it benefited him as well, is Chris Paul. He gets traded to the Rockets. He opts into his contract with the Clippers, has them trade him to the Rockets. Clippers get back Beverly Williams, Decker, Harrell, Kelly Liggins, Quarterman, and a 2018 first-round pick with a small protection there. Let's look at this Rockets team, first of all, that just cleared out a ton of players in that deal, but also the potential for a banana boat finally team. At this point, should Paul, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, all these guys who will all be free agents next summer still be aiming to get together, or are we looking at an NBA that is too far and a group of guys that's too old for that banana boat team to still be a goal?
Yeah, Sarah, I don't think that team's good enough anymore. Really. LeBron is still at the peak of his powers, but I would guess he only has another year or two left in the prime of his career. Dwayne Wade, having watched him in Chicago this past season, day in, day out, I mean, he is nowhere near what he used to be. He still has those moments in time where he can score 25 or 30, but those are very few and far between. Carmelo Anthony has had some nice moments in New York City as a Knick, but do you trust him day in, day out to go out and score 25 or 30 points and to be that guy that he was 5 or 6 years ago? No. I mean, he's been in the league too long. He doesn't have a real desire to play defense at a high level all the time. Chris Paul is the most interesting question mark in that group to me, Sarah, because for as great as Paul is and has still shown to be, is he that kind of point guard that you can count on for 75 or 80 games a season and know that every night he's going to go out and drop all kinds of different numbers on teams? I'm not sold on Paul as a guy you're giving $200 million to, that's for sure. And, I know these guys talked about in years past playing together and trying to find a way to win together. But the reality is, I don't think the league has passed them by. I just think they would need even more help than they would have needed a few years ago.
And I guess you have to figure how many of them, too, are willing to take pay cuts, because you're going to need that money to spend to get other guys, younger guys.
Right, it can't be a four-man team.
Right. What do you make of the Rockets giving up all those pieces to the Clippers and the space that they'll have there?
Well, I commend the Clippers for getting something in return. And so many people want to compare what the Clippers got back. In this case, a week ago, we saw the Bulls deal Jimmy Butler, and they get back Zach LaVine and Larry Markkinen and Chris Dunn, and that's a nice package, but they knew that they still had leverage. There were 2 years left on Jimmy Butler's deal. The Clippers, they didn't have much leverage at all. So anything they got back in return from Houston has to be viewed as a positive. And we've been discussing it throughout the show, but when you've got the Clippers situation with where they're going now after not being able to get over the hump so many different times in the last few postseasons, any young piece that you can get and see what you've got in that piece, go for it. What do you have to lose right now? The Clippers aren't winning a title. The Clippers are either trying everything they can to land LeBron next summer, or they're going to blow it up completely and potentially build around Blake Griffin if he wants to take $200+ million. So as the Clippers try to figure out which lane they're in, I had no problem with the decision they made to bring back the pieces from Houston that they got. And I think in the long run, frankly, I think the Clippers may be in better shape than we're giving them credit for right now.
You mentioned that they were lucky to get good pieces because they didn't really have the leverage. In Chicago, Jimmy Butler had 2 years left. Chris Paul says he wants to go to Houston. He knows that he has to use the Clippers to get there, or else he loses his bird rights and his ability to make that max deal. So, in some ways, yes, the Rockets have more leverage because that's where he wants to be. But on the other hand, he can't just opt out and become a free agent and go there. He needs them. So I guess that must have been some interesting deliberation between both sides, because the Rockets know in the end the Clippers want to make it happen. But the Clippers also know that they don't have to give them exactly what they want, because they can say to him, all right, fine, just leave then. They don't want to lose him for nothing, of course, but they can call his bluff and say, you're not going to just opt out.
Right, because you're not going to leave all that money on the table.
Yeah, so it must have been interesting to be in that room as they tried to make that deal happen and figure out exactly who was delivering what to whom. This is The Right Time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Sarah Spain and Nick Friedel filling in for Bomani. Hope to talk to Ramona Shelburne next about the NBA news, and if not, you'll just get us gabbing more about the latest news. It's ESPN Radio. This is The Right Time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Bomani Jones off. It's Nick Friedel and Sarah Spain. We'll be back hosting again on Friday if you like what you heard. And we'll be back if you didn't like it, so your opinion doesn't matter. But hopefully you'll join us on Friday as well. We are presented by Progressive Insurance. Nick, as we look to the power changes and the reactions that teams will have to the latest news, producer Shannon came up with a pretty good question, and that was, who do you think's in a better position right now, the Knicks or the Clippers?
It's a really good question, Sarah, and I'd have to go with the Knicks. And I can feel people laughing at me as they listen to us right
Besides
now going
me,
through this. Right. You're just in a large group, but
right.
I say that because I think Porzingis is the best player on either one of those teams moving forward. Who knows what the Clippers will decide to do with Blake Griffin, and he's been great when he's been able to stay on the floor and stay injury free. But that's, of course, been tough for him these last few years. I just think that Porzingis at age 21 offers such a bright future for the Knicks, and if they can just get a few other pieces around there, I think with the money they're able to spend, that they could be in really good shape. Of course, the issue here is James Dolan has run them into the ground time and time again with decisions that he's made. It's just that Porzingis has that ability to be a franchise-changing type of talent, and that's why I lean towards New York.
And we mentioned earlier that the latest draft pick for the Knicks, Frank N., whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce, injured his knee during a practice session. This according to the New York Daily News. Walked a little gingerly and had his knee taped up. The fact that we haven't heard a bunch more out of that leads me to believe it's probably minor. But worth noting that on his way out, Phil cursed them, the remaining lot. All right, so let's look at these rosters right now. Right now, the Clippers, they've got DeAndre Jordan. They technically still have Blake Griffin. They don't have him because he's opted out, but he hasn't, he could be re-signed. He could stick with them depending on what kind of overtures they make toward him and depending on how he feels about continuing with this team minus Chris Paul. Jamal Crawford, Austin Rivers, Paul Pierce is retired, so even though he's on their books, he's no longer with them. Luke Mbah-a-Moute, and then a handful of other guys. The New York Knicks, on the other hand, have obviously Frank N. and Carmelo Anthony, who is now seeking a buyout. They claim to be interested in re-upping Derrick Rose. We'll see exactly how much they offer and whether Rose has tempered his expectations for his next deal based on, sort of his limited... and he's got bird rights too, right, Rose? Because that came in a trade?
I mean, Sarah, look, the problem for Derek, I think he's going to see this once free agency opens, is while there may be interest in his services, the money that he thought might have been there a year or two ago, it's just not going to happen. And so whether he stays in New York or he goes somewhere else, I know we've heard San Antonio as a possibility, and New Orleans makes sense. They need some point guard help. If you're Derek and you have signed this mega max deal a couple seasons ago and then dealt with all the other knee injuries, I think it's really going to be an issue for his ego moving forward, just because the money that should have been there if he had been able to stay healthy isn't going to be there in the long run.
He is guaranteed, I'm not sure, for those bird rights if the Knicks want to keep him. Do you know in the CBA, if a player is willing to take less in negotiating, would they be able to? If the Knicks want to hang on to him but they don't want to give him what he's deserved based on bird rights, is that a possibility, do you know, or is that required of the team if they hang on to him?
No, I mean, I think they can work out whatever deal they want. If Derek wants to take a little less, that's his prerogative. But
okay.
Having been around Derek and having seen what he's gone through from a physical and a health perspective, Sarah, I don't envision Derek taking less anywhere.
All right, so here's why I think the Clippers are in a better position, because there's still a chance that they hang on to Blake Griffin. They've got Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, a ton of pieces that they got from the Rockets today in that deal. And it's a good landing spot because it's in LA. And they've had a great deal of success of late. It's just a matter of shaking up some pieces and seeing if you fill a couple things in now they've gotten rid of Paul, if it helps. The Knicks have James Dolan at the helm, which to me is the number one problem, and things will not get better. And their lengthy playoff and their championship drought stem from terrible leadership up top. They owe Joakim Noah $17.7 million next year, $18.5 million in 18-19, and $19.2 million in 2019-2020. So if you ask me, the Clippers are in a better situation than the Knicks.
There's still time and hope, Sarah. That's all they got right now in New York.
Well, at least they did get the good news today that Phil is out, and that's what they were hoping for. Now they move forward. And David Griffin may be in the mix, or Masai Ujiri. We'll see. Thanks for listening. Spain and Friedel, Jalen and Jacoby coming up next on ESPN Radio. This has been The Right Time.